Ready to roll. Let's do this. What is going on? We are here for the NFL Awesemo strategy show on Friday afternoon. A casual beat with a nice little roll. I really liked it, producer Mike. I dig it. I dig it. I am here as I am every Friday afternoon, at least for the end of the season here, with my co-host Matt Gajeski. Follow him on Twitter, Matt_Gajeski. How are you, Matt?
I'm doing great, man. Excited for these games. We had some competitive ones, some non-competitive ones last week, but the way this spread set up, I think we should get some pretty good football here this weekend.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that these playoff newcomers, Cincinnati Bengals, could make some noise here against a Tennessee Titans team who really haven't actually put it all together with the lineup that they thought they were going to have all season. So I'm really excited there. And of course, that Saturday night game we're going to be digging into with the 49ers and the Green Bay Packers, two of the NFL's most storied franchises and who have some recent bad blood in some recent playoff games. I know Aaron Rodgers wants to win that one really, really bad. Go ahead and like this video, guys. Subscribe to the channel. You guys know what to do. We're in the divisional round of the NFL playoffs. If you don't know what to do with our YouTube videos at this point, I don't know for you guys, but yeah, thrilled to be here. We're going to be talking about the Saturday slate, the 2-game Saturday slate specifically here. And oh, I forgot. You can follow me on Twitter at Draftaholic as well. We'd also like to thank our presenting sponsor, Jock Market. We'll get into them. But first, I want to talk about this 2-game slate from a bird's eye view. What are you thinking about these 2-game environments? Is there one game that you're going to be targeting players from? Or is there one game where you're going to be taking running backs and then ignoring the passing attacks, or vice versa? What are you really thinking with this 2-gamer?
As far as the full context of the 4 games we have, these two leave a little bit to be desired, but still not that much. They're both 47-point totals. They're tied for the lowest on the board. But again, LA and Tampa Bay, that's just at 48. The real impressive game from a total perspective is Buffalo, Kansas City at 54. But if you're playing the 4-game slate, these are the 2 early games. They do have the lowest totals on the board, so that is worth noting. You do have a team in Green Bay as a heavy favorite who's still tied for the second highest implied team total on the board, tied with Buffalo, which is just narrowly behind Kansas City. So the Packers stand out to me if you're playing the 4-game slate. But overall, I could see any of these games going over the total. And we have a lot of premier quarterback plays. So all the stacking options and skill position players are still pretty enticing, despite the totals being a little bit lower.
Yeah, so game total's a little bit lower. Packers implied total. Glad you brought that up. That was in my notes as well to make sure that you understand that their offensive ceiling in terms of the Green Bay Packers is as high as any implied ceiling on this slate here. That's definitely worth mentioning, despite these game environments looking less enticing. Now, let me ask you this. This might be a little extreme, but would you go so far as playing a 4-game slate, this Saturday, Sunday slate, like on DraftKings, where they have some huge prizes? That is essentially their main slate this week. And then just kind of fading these 2 games, or maybe playing 1 or 2 players from these 2 games?
I definitely think you can do that. There's pros and cons to both. I think the pros are you get a lot of late swap equity. So you're just gaining more information, what happens with Cincinnati, Green Bay, San Francisco, and Tennessee. But at the same time, people that take that approach could be foregoing some of the best plays on the slate. So I do think sometimes it's overstated, the equity late swap gives you. With Derrick Henry putting up 40 points potentially, you're probably not live to win if you save and try to late swap equity out of him. So you're always trying to walk that balance where, okay, I do get more information, but if somebody puts up a monstrous score, I'm not live to win anyway.
Yeah. So we got to get into those players, which ones are kind of live to get those monster scores. I did mention that I would love if you guys could give us a like and subscribe. That really, really helps us boost up in your YouTube algorithms. I know Laffy's always talking about our YouTube overlords, but he's kind of right. Those likes really help us go a long way. And we always appreciate you guys hanging out with us on a Friday afternoon. We've also got some pretty great free tools available for you over on Awesemo.com today. We got NBA player projections, we got NHL player projections, and the UFC pros plays. Say that 10 times fast. And yeah, so definitely check that out over there. Hit that notification bell too on the video below so that you always know when we're going live. Okay, we've kind of dug into this from a bird's eye view. Let's go into this game by game. We'll start with the Cincinnati Tennessee game. As you mentioned, Cincinnati is underdogs here by 3.5 points, and it's tied for the lowest total game here on the slate. Let's start at the Cincinnati side of the ball. What are you thinking? Are we targeting this passing game, or are we going to Joe Mixon, who kind of had an underwhelming performance against Las Vegas last week?
On the context of the 2-game slate, I think Burrow is the second best quarterback to target. We'll talk about Aaron Rodgers in a little bit, but the alternatives on this slate aren't quite as great as the Sunday slate, where we have Mahomes, Stafford, Josh Allen, and Brady. It's basically just Burrow and Rodgers, and then there's a drop off down to Tannehill and Garoppolo. So I think Burrow is somebody we need to consider just based out of necessity here. And I like that we can stack him pretty easily. You have the elite option in Chase. You have T. Higgins, whose price has fallen. And historically this season, we've seen the opportunity between them almost identical with a slight edge towards Chase. These guys just alternate big games. So to me, that suggests we might just have a buy low situation where we can take T. Higgins at a cheap price. But ultimately, on a 2-game slate, I don't really see any reason why you can't stack both of them. As for Mixon, the volume's been there for him all season long. It's just basically been a matter of whether he scores or not. The efficiency's been middling for Mixon, but the volume's been pretty solid. They're only slight underdogs, so it's not a situation where I really see Tennessee getting up by a lot of points and Mixon getting phased out of this game plan. Ultimately, to me, it comes down whether Mixon scores or not. And on this slate, we do have alternatives. So tentatively at the price, I am leaning towards some of the other options we'll talk about in a little bit. But how do you view Cincinnati? I think they're pretty attractive despite having the second lowest implied team total.
Yeah, I think there's a bunch of reasons you could say that they're enticing, especially on this 2-game slate, right? Because the passing attack has been very explosive at times this season. You've got 2 receivers who have 150 plus receiving yards upside in this game. I mean, they've done it over the last 5 weeks, both of them at least once here. And, as Tennessee tends to play when they're all healthy, they tend to be rush focused, which means that even if they are playing from ahead, they don't tend to run up the score. Now, anything's possible when you talk about one football game here, but I think this game most likely stays close, which means that all of these players are more than viable. Joe Burrow has 18.7 expected fantasy points per game over his last 6 weeks of starts here, and he's 6 fantasy points over expected per game. That's by far the number one player in terms of efficiency among the 4 quarterbacks on this slate. So I love Cincinnati passing stacks here. Not afraid of Joe Mixon. I will say that he's not coming into my lineups quite as much. Right now, the player I'm buying low on, as you said, is T. Higgins, both on DraftKings and FanDuel. I have him in over 50% of my current builds of lineups. I think it is a buy low situation. I know Jamar Chase has an equally high ceiling, but I'll take that salary discount with Higgins.
I agree with you. I think Higgins is an excellent play. And I do think people might be a little scared away from him right now, just based on recent performance. But again, I think if you go back to the larger sample, what we've seen throughout the year, it's kind of like Tampa Bay when they're fully healthy. Those guys a lot of times alternate big games, and we always want pieces of this situation. So if you're playing multiple lineups, I think you just take stabs on both Higgins and Chase. But if you're playing just one lineup, I do like the salary savings that Higgins offers you. And I'm even interested in Boyd for a lot of the same reasons we mentioned. He's a pretty distant third in terms of targets and opportunity. But even his low ADOT targets and his price are really interesting to me on this slate. I like all of the pass catchers for Cincinnati.
Yeah, even CJ Uzoma, as we saw last week, he hit big time last week. They all have expected fantasy points over 8 fantasy points per game, meaning that expected volume for the auxiliary weapons in Cincinnati are much higher than your typical auxiliary weapons around the league here. Let's jump over to the Tennessee side of the ball. This is really exciting because they have the lineup on offense that they expected to have going into this season, and they really never got to see it all mesh together. But here we are in the divisional round. They're the number 1 seed. Some might say a weak number 1 seed. But what do we expect the workload for the big dog Derrick Henry coming back from injury here in his first game back?
So he's been practicing for a while now. Luckily, Tennessee did end up earning the bye. It's probably one of the least talked about situations that's still one of the most impactful is that Derrick Henry got this extra week. They didn't have to force him into action in the wild card round. And this guy's been practicing since the end of the regular season. And I'm sure a lot of you follow the Titans on social media. It's been the big story around Tennessee is getting these clips out of Derrick Henry. And I'm not a doctor. I'm also not on the Tennessee Titans staff. I don't know what a full practice looks like, but it sure does look like Derrick Henry's doing a lot out there. I know he's been taking contact in practice. All that's really positive for the workload I think he should see this weekend. And again, they've been saving him for this. They've been gearing him up for this. And maybe it's not 100% the Derrick Henry workload we saw previously. I mean, this guy was getting 30 carries at times, but even 75% of Derrick Henry, what is that? 20 to 22 touches? That's a ridiculous workload, and it should pace this slate. At his price, which is maybe $2,500 cheaper than where we saw him at his peak, he's an excellent value.
Yeah, and I think he is really platform dependent. And this is a big pet peeve. It's the old family guy really grinds my gears situation because I know players are technically a better value site to site, but we're really trying to parse out who's going to play well. And I know we're always good here at Awesemo talking about the range of outcomes. Any player on a one-game slate can do poorly or do excellently, but Derrick Henry's salary is so drastically different on FanDuel versus DraftKings this week. It really does make a difference. 7,500 on DraftKings makes him one of the most appealing players on the slate. On FanDuel, where it's 9K, you're essentially getting absolutely no salary discount. You really want him to get closer to that 28, 29 opportunity games that we saw before he went down with injury. There's some wiggle room here. There's some room for error with Derrick Henry with his DraftKings salary. And he's still got a median projection that rivals his typical game here, something like 18, 19 points. So his odds of getting 30 fantasy points are still really high here. I think one of the flex points here are, can Derrick Henry and AJ Brown have ceiling games? And are you willing to play AJ Brown? It's only a few weeks removed since he had that monster 16 target game, 200 air yard game, 11 catches, 145 receiving yards. Can you play them together, or they kind of steal production away from each other, even though the Titans are favored?
I think if you do play them together, it's probably a Titans onslaught, and you're probably running someone back on Cincinnati. On a 2-game slate, I'm definitely okay with this. And I even think I'm okay with it on a 4-game slate too. It's not a 12-game main slate where we have plenty of options and the opportunity cost is going to be much greater, just a higher likelihood that some random player outscores them. On a smaller slate, you don't have as much of that opportunity cost, and you can take on some of this negative correlation. So especially on a 2-game slate, if this plays beyond the spread and Tennessee wins this game by 10, 14 points, you could easily see both of these guys have a ceiling game. And you mentioned it at the beginning when we first started talking about Tennessee. We have such a small sample of these players all together, that being Julio Jones, AJ Brown, and Derrick Henry. Tannehill's efficiency is monstrous when all three of these guys play. If they're healthy for the whole game, we could see Tennessee rout Cincinnati. I don't think that's likely, and neither do the bookmakers, but it's certainly in the realm of possibility. And I think it's something worth taking shots on.
Yeah, oh man, if I could quantify it, it's probably a 10%, 15% chance, but in those 10% of outcomes, yeah, there is like a Tennessee smash ceiling for them in there. That would be kind of cool to see as well. They'd certainly be the force to be reckoned with that their seed implies that they are. Talk to me real quick about these auxiliary weapons. We got Julio Jones, arguably the healthiest he's been all season. Other players like Nick Westbrook-Akine, Anthony Firkser, anybody piquing your interest here?
Yeah, one last thing on the Tennessee onslaught. One thing you highlighted specifically before the Rams showdown on Monday night is, in big tournaments, we want to play for some of this uncertainty and some of these alternative outcomes. And that is one of them. So that's something I'm trying to keep in mind, especially after your great call on Akers last week. So props to you. And that is one of them. But anyway, I think Julio is in play for the auxiliary weapons. He's very cheap comparatively. And I do think he's going to be third in terms of what playmakers they try to get involved in this offense. But if he catches a touchdown at his price, he certainly could be viable on the 2-game slate. I don't have a ton of interest in like Westbrook-Akine. There's just loose enough pricing where I don't necessarily think you need to get there. And if you're finding yourself in that price range, there's other alternatives. Ferkser is a little bit tough for me to get to. Again, we do have some pretty decent tight ends on this slate. And if you're punting, I think I prefer Uzoma and like maybe a DeGuara on the other side. The Titans tight ends are pretty distant for me in terms of where I want to look on this slate.
Yeah, they always do something weird in the playoffs, though, where they're like, bro, Derrick Henry is throwing to an offensive lineman. So I do feel like in the largest of large field tournaments, you can just like count on the Mike Vrabel getting weird effect a little bit. That's completely narrative based. Julio Jones is more intriguing on this 2-game slate than the 4-game slate to me. He does have a projection ahead of salary based expectations, but I kind of want him as a piece of a larger Titans game stack here. I don't necessarily want him as any kind of runoff. Any last thoughts here before we switch over to the other game?
I don't think so. I think we hit on it for the most part. Overall, I do think this one has the most game stacking appeal just because the spread is tighter. But there's a lot of great skill position players and certainly ones I want to be targeting. I think the next game has more uncertainty as far as these skill position players, which we'll get into.
I see what you're saying. I'm not so sure. We'll talk about it in a minute. I want to remind you guys we are sponsored by Jock Market today. Thanks again to Jock Market for sponsoring these Friday videos every single week. And they're a really cool platform over there. You got to check them out because they've turned fantasy sports into a real life stock exchange where you can make money every minute, every second, every hour, where you're buying and selling shares of your favorite players or maybe your least favorite players for real money in real time. You can use our exclusive promo code Awesemo, AWESEMO, to get up to a $50 bonus on your first deposit. You can download the app in the Google Play Store, in the App Store, or go to Jock Market on the web, and they have markets for the NFL, MLB, PGA, which is just starting up, the NBA going strong. I said NFL, I think I did. And they've got a pre-game IPO to pick up shares of your favorite players. Check out Jock Market today. Use that promo code Awesemo. And thanks once again for sponsoring this video. We really appreciate you guys. Yeah, definitely check out the app today. Okay, hopping over to the San Francisco Green Bay game. More uncertainty, I would say, if only because these two teams know each other well. But I feel like, especially with San Francisco, we kind of know that they're going to have a big 4 here. And Eli Mitchell, especially, like he's going to get plenty of touches in this backfield. Start with the San Francisco, the road team here. What are we doing with this offense on this 2-game slate?
I think Eli Mitchell has the most consistent workload of anybody on San Francisco right now. And there's a couple reasons for this. One, Garoppolo is playing injured, and he's been playing injured for multiple weeks now. At first, it was the thumb, I believe, on the hand or whatever finger it was. He had some sort of hand injury. But he got banged up in their most recent game too. And one thing we've seen with San Francisco is they've increasingly relied on the run down the stretch. And it wasn't just in their playoff victory too. In week 18, we saw a lot of touches for Eli Mitchell, who hasn't been healthy himself, but that hasn't necessarily mattered. And he's practicing in full. So really no worries with Mitchell overall. But with Garoppolo banged up, I have not only worries about him, but some of these other pass catchers. And Debo is going to work so much as a running back in the backfield that I don't think he's affected as much as players like Brandon Ayuk and Juwan Jennings could be. I think those players might carry a little more risk than people are actually thinking because not only does San Francisco already lean towards the run, but what does Jimmy Garoppolo look like out there? I have questions.
Yeah, man. They are the #1 team in our advanced stats tool in our game script adjusted rush rate, meaning they literally are the most run heavy team. It may be underselling them to call them leaning towards the run. They really lean on it. And especially if there is some sort of tipping point where Jimmy Garoppolo is too injured, they're just going to lean into the rush even more if Trey Lance has to come in. I know this is really, really hard to quantify, but are we near the point where Trey Lance might have to come in here? I mean, it sounds like you're kind of concerned about the injuries piling up for Garoppolo.
I want to say yes, but they just haven't shown any willingness to do that. Like every chance that Trey Lance has had to take over this starting job, it's boom, right back to Garoppolo, no matter what. And I feel like they've rushed Garoppolo back a few times. Like his most recent game, I think he was healthy enough, but the game before that, I wasn't even expecting Garoppolo to play. And then he gets in limited practices throughout the week and Shanahan throws him back out there. So at this point, it really seems like he has faith in Garoppolo for whatever that's worth to at least manage the game. Whereas Lance, and I mean, we have to think about Lance a little bit. This guy, he didn't play his final season in college. They had one game, and he's coming from the FCS level. The guy had something ridiculous, like under 500 career pass attempts in college, and he got drafted number 3 overall. And there's a lot of high expectations for him. But at the end of the day, we have to remember we don't have any real basis for FCS level quarterback play outside of Wentz. And this guy didn't play his final season in college. Like, it was going to take some time with Trey Lance. I don't think Shanahan's really eager to get him out there, especially when the lights are brightest against the Green Bay Packers.
Yeah, and it's not really the time for super high variance. You're not so much of an underdog on the road at Lambeau Field here that you have to make some sort of high variance move. And I do think that Kyle Shanahan is looking at this simply from we can't turn the ball over. That will be our backbreaker here. And so Jimmy Garoppolo gives our offense on any given drive right now a significantly less chance of throwing an interception or having a fumble. Not saying it's zero, because Garoppolo hasn't been exactly perfect in that regard, but he certainly has been more accurate and less interception prone in his sample size this season. So talk to me about these superstar players, Deebo Samuel and George Kittle, because Kittle's been used as a blocker significantly more as this team has leaned on the run, which has included Deebo Samuel. So does Deebo Samuel getting more of his opportunity in the rushing game lower his ceiling, raise his ceiling? And how does it change your expectations for Kittle in this 1-game slate? Or excuse me, this 2-game slate?
I'll start with Deebo first. I do think it changes his bottom line a little bit. We know targets are just by default, especially on DraftKings, a little more valuable than carries. What I will say with Deebo, though, is he's in there on really high value touches. So in the run game, he'll be in there in the red zone. So his scoring expectation isn't necessarily changed. And we know they're going to feature Deebo Samuel, whether it's as a receiver or as a runner. So I'm not concerned with the opportunities for Deebo. But one thing we've noticed down the stretch, and you mentioned Kittle blocking a lot. And as a team, that's true. But he actually led the team in routes run last week. It was just he only ran 23 routes because this team ran the ball so much.
Right,
and
right.
That might change here if they get down in this game. And if Kittle is forced into a negative game script alongside Garoppolo, that's where you could see the ceiling coaxed out of him. But if San Francisco can play their game, he still might lead the team in routes, but 23 routes, that's not going to cut it.
Yeah, that's like the 3rd or 4th most routes on the Cincinnati Bengals on a more pass happy team, or like the LA Rams. Yeah. So, I mean, that lowers the ceiling here, but the the talent in Kittle is undeniable. You had 3 straight games, though they're over 90 yards receiving. I am getting to him a bunch on DraftKings right now. Deebo Samuel is the one that kind of scares me a little bit with that high salary tag, especially on this 2-gamer. I do have some of him. I mean, I'm really, really not intrigued by players like Jawan Jennings. There is a little bit of consistency in usage for Brandon Ayuk. Do you have any interest in Brandon Ayuk, who essentially is become like a 4 to 6 target guy every single week?
I do have a little bit of interest, but honestly, in low risk contests, cash formats, and most of my lineups, I think I would rather just play Tyler Boyd. How do you feel about that?
Yeah. I mean, I like the fact that Ayuk kind of played himself out of the doghouse. And now when it's the playoffs, he's not only getting the snap share and route share, but he's actually seeing the targets. But I do think eventually when push comes to shove, you're going to see that usage go to 2 players, George Kittle and Deebo Samuel. I think there's a possibility he gets phased out even in a pass heavier game script than usual for San Francisco. Guys, before we dig into our final team here, I want to remind you guys, let's get access to all the great Awesemo Plus tools and content for every or nearly every DFS sport out there with an Awesemo Plus weekly pass for $29.95. This includes full access to the premium content and tools on Awesemo.com, including those player projections, ownership projections, top stacks, the lineup builder, and much, much more. Of course, if you're only looking to play NFL DFS, then you can sign up for an Awesemo Plus NFL package for as low as $3.95 weekly. Stop guessing, start winning, join Awesemo Plus today. Okay, so the home favorite Green Bay Packers, the #1 seed, and it is supposed to be frigid cold, frigid Lambeau Field next Saturday here. And so what do you think of Aaron Rodgers and Devontae Adams, this dynamic duo here in the passing attack?
Love them. This is their home field advantage. I don't think the cold is necessarily going to affect them as much. They've been through this many, many times at this point. But overall, I think in the context of the really expensive receivers, you kind of said this with Deebo Samuel, is I would just rather play Devontae Adams. Devontae Adams is the more consistent target share, the more consistent role, the higher implied team total, the higher pass rate. Outside of just the leverage you might gain from Deebo, it's pretty clear to me Devontae Adams is the number one. And I think I would rather even play a guy like Jamar Chase than Deebo Samuel. So he's pretty distant number three. And there's just not enough superlatives for Devontae Adams. He's very clearly the best receiver on this slate. And I think there's the case to be made that he's the best receiver on the 4-game slate as well.
And now, is that salary contextualized because of players like Cooper Kupp having such high salaries? Or are you saying that you really think that Adams has a chance to compete with Kupp in terms of ceiling ability this weekend?
His volume's better than Kupp's right now. Kupp has seven targets in 3 straight games. Stafford spread the ball a little more recently. We know Kupp's just as consistent as Devontae Adams. The real differentiating factor between them this year has been LA's extreme pass rate. And Green Bay, they are a little slower. They do lean a little more towards the run. Devontae Adams has a target share similar to Cooper Kupp's. All these metrics underlying are very, very similar between the two. But if Kupp is going to see 7 targets a game, I certainly prefer Adams. And I think the real question is, where does ownership fall? Because if you do get a low owned Kupp, I would rather go back to Kupp, assuming maybe the 7 target games are just a blip on the radar and we can fall back on the larger sample. But right now, I expect Kupp to be more owned than Adams. So tentatively, I'm going to go towards the higher team total with Green Bay here and inside with Adams. How do you feel about that? Do you think that's crazy?
Well, something tells me we're not going to get a low-owned Cooper Kupp, especially in the year 2022. Yeah, we're not getting it this week. But I don't think that's crazy at all. I think that in terms of optimal lineup percentage versus expected ownership, Devontae Adams looks like a positive leverage play on this slate. And I think I just don't know the way that the pass rate for the Rams and the rate of plays is going to shift for that game environment playing against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. I do think the volume could be equal. And if that's the case, then I think Cooper Kupp could run away with it here. But in terms of percentage chances to score as much or more than Cooper Kupp, hands down, the best player for me is Devontae Adams. And then you said, I think that number 3 player is actually Jamar Chase before Deebo Samuel. So that's just a little bit of a breakdown. We only got a couple minutes here, but we really broke down the most important players here. Talk to me about this backfield, though. A.J. Dillon has certainly earned the right to get more touches here, but Aaron Jones is the most healthy he's been all season. Am I wrong?
No, I think you're right. And they've been cautious with Aaron Jones. I think that's something they should definitely do. So I like that they held him out. He's a guy that's really been banged up down the stretch, but we know Aaron Jones really gives you that dynamic element in the pass game. And A.J. Dillon can catch himself, but he just can't do quite as much as Jones. He's not going to line up in the slot. He's not going to be utilized around the red zone as a receiver quite as much as Jones. So just having him back is positive. But ultimately, I do expect this to be a split to some degree. And you just can't say that about Tennessee. You can't say that about Cincinnati. So I think you need to bump them down a little bit. Where I think you might gain the edge is ownership. If we get a really low owned Aaron Jones and even A.J. Dillon for that matter, as bigger favorites in the spot, it's a spot I want to target for the sake of the leverage it might provide.
Yeah, I agree there. And I'm actually using ownership as my guide here for this Saturday slate, just because so many people are going to see Devontae Adams and Aaron Rodgers and go to that. Home favorite running backs are players we want to target in general here. So I will be just over the field on both Jones and Dillon. Let's close this out. Any thoughts about Alan Lazard, Marcus Valdez-Scantling, Josiah DeGuara, who had a big 62-yard touchdown in the Packers' last game of the season? Anybody appealing for you in this game?
I think it's a great spot for tournaments. And you mentioned some of the players that are coming back. They've been really injured in their ancillary pass catchers lately. You could even play like a Randall Cobb who's coming off injured reserve. But Lazard has been the player who's kind of played through injury and been a solid producer for this team. So I don't really see them taking Lazard off the field. I think tight end is also interesting. You could maybe play DeGuara on the 2-game slate. A lot less interested in the 4-game. But on the 2-gamer, you really just have Kittle and Uzoma, and then you're throwing darts from there. So if Kittle fails, I think you could definitely play one of these ancillary options.
Yeah, I agree. I'm not super intrigued, to be honest, for these players, any of them, but in large field tournaments, when I pack them on to Packers stack, then I'm going to be getting to some of them here real quick because we got to get out of here. Who are your top 3 players on this slate? We'll say platform agnostic, just best players in a vacuum.
Position agnostic?
Position agnostic as well.
Okay, number 1 is Davante Adams. Number 2, I like the leverage that T. Higgins provides. And number 3 is Derrick Henry for me, just underpriced for the value and the role we're expecting if he's healthy.
Man, you took away my little value option in T. Higgins, so I will say that I'm getting to a ton of A.J. Brown. We didn't talk about him a ton, but I really, really like him against a Cincinnati defense that is the worst defense in schedule-adjusted fantasy points allowed of all the defenses that qualified for the playoffs. Okay, guys, that is going to wrap things up for the NFL strategy show for this 2-game slate. We have got so much more content coming up this Friday. At 1, we've got the Yahoo NFL strategy show with Adam Kaufman and Eric. 2 p.m., the NHL strategy show with Cliffy and Harris. 3 p.m., an NFL tournament strategy show with Greg and Neil. And then at 4:45, the NBA deeper dive and live before lock with your usual cast of Laffy, Adam, Greg, and Eric. For Matt Gajeski, Matt_Gajeski on Twitter. I'm Matt Savoca at Draftaholic. We will see you guys next time.